we were working on this, and I think we got a wee bit into it, but not too far before we wrapped things up at a nice spot last time. So just quickly review our roots are lingu and turb. Lingu, of course, is language, but it more specifically is coming from the word for our tongue. And as I say, most of the sounds that we make with our mouths to speak words are created by moving our tongues in different places. And actually, if you do study linguistics in the future in university, a lot of time is taken describing what your tongue does when you're making sounds, which is interesting. And actually, where it touches on your mouth, the roof of your mouth, your teeth, for example, as well. And then turb is coming from the Latin word for agitation. So rubbing things together really is the root of that. So very quickly, we had quite a few different prefixes this time, by, dis, per, and tri. And these ones I think are pretty obviously taken from numerals, right? And I think I said last time that three, the number for three, that sound, that three or three, there's variations of it, but a lot of languages that are in the Indo-European grouping have this sound for the letter, or for the number three, sorry. And then for suffixes, al, ants, ents, ent, ix, and ist. So let's just go through the words very quickly again to remind ourselves of them. And I think that we did make it through these, so we'll just move on to the next spot. So disturbed, or disturb rather, linguist, bilingual, perturb, lingual, linguistics, trilingual, turbulence, disturbance, and turbulent. So we do have quite a few words that are relating to forces of nature and actual, I guess, as I say, agitation of different things, whether it is the wind being a turbulent thing or having maybe a turbulent conversation. Some of these words are used in both literal ways and metaphorical ways. So I'll just actually go through these very, very quickly before we get into it, just to remind us of what we said. So the science of language being linguistics, having or expressed in three languages is trilingual. One who specializes in languages is obviously a linguist. Involving two languages, bilingual. Relating to the tongue, lingual. To bother or interrupt, disturb. To worry or upset is perturb. And confusion, excited activity, and also wind currents that move very quickly is turbulence. So if anybody has been on an airplane before, we might have felt or been warned, for instance, over the intercom that maybe we were going to hit some turbulence. And so that's another way it can be used. Interruption, disorder, or turmoil. Right, so this is a disturbance. And stormy or disorderly is turbulent. So let's move into the example sentences. And after we do these 10, what we'll do is we'll switch over and do a little bit of discussing our historical root that we were going to talk about today. And then we'll come back to the next lesson afterwards. Okay, number one, although her native tongue was Spanish, the blank teacher spoke English fluently. The bilingual teacher, that's right. Very good. The anthropologist researched the blank of all of the neighboring tribes. Linguistics, yes. This is definitely something that the anthropologists will do. I actually do see another possibility here as well, and I want to give it as an example, just so that we can see. So we talked last time how an anthropologist and a sociologist, the difference is that a sociologist is studying how society is running, and an anthropologist is really looking at what the people are doing exactly. What do they believe in? For example, what languages do they speak as well? One other sentence that we could do is research the the turbulence between the neighboring tribes. If this was worded in this way, it's also a sentence that could be appropriate, because sometimes there are, say, a little bit of I guess rivalries between different tribes that are researched by anthropologists as well. So number 3, most European students are blank and not only know English as but a second foreign language as well. So yeah, I think trilingual in this case, meaning that they know 2 other additional languages, which is very much the case in Europe, mainly because there are so many small countries close to one another in this area. I knew someone from Switzerland long, long ago, and they didn't only speak Swiss German because it is a form of German, but they also spoke the German that was spoken in Germany, as well as French as as another language. So it is true. It's quite common for people to have at least 3 languages in Europe. Avery enjoyed traveling around the world as a professional linguist. Yeah. It can be really, it's hard for some people. It's really, really interesting linguistics. For some people, it's a little boring because they're like, what's the point of this? Why are we looking so deep into language? But for some people, it can be really, really neat. There is a kind of, I guess, like doing a puzzle almost and discovering something new. Okay. So the dentist discovered an infection on the blank side of the patient's tooth, the lingual side. Yeah. This happens, right? Sometimes whenever we bite our tongues, if we're eating, for instance, this can happen. A canker sore can develop. The sea is too blank for sailing. Turbulent. Yeah. And one fun thing, speaking of sea, just because we're going to be talking a little bit about the historical parts of Roman and Greek culture, the god of the ocean and the sea in ancient Greek culture was Poseidon. And actually, a lot of the times people would pray to him before they would even go onto the ocean because of the turbulent nature of the ocean. Not only in terms of just the waves and the storms that can happen, but also the large creatures that were not so safe for human beings to interact with, whales, sharks, etc. So a lot of the times, this was something that people did. And we do still see Poseidon, or if we want to use his Latin name, Neptune, which we also have a planet named after him. And of course, a big reason why they named Neptune the way it is it's a very dark blue color. Both the planets Neptune and Uranus are like this. All right. Number 7, don't blank the baby. She's asleep. Disturb. Yeah, this one's pretty easy. Our nation experienced much blank in the 1960s, meaning the United States here. Disturbance. Turbulence, sorry, not disturbance. Turbulence, yes, absolutely. And it wasn't all, this doesn't mean it was all negative or bad things that were going on in the 1960s. It was that there was just a lot of change and a lot of political protesting, these kinds of things, and a very big change in, I guess, the old ways into a new way. This was the time of after all the hippies and this kind of psychedelic music, all kinds of new art was coming out during this time. But there was also some very, very unfortunate things happening during this time. The Vietnam War, which many people didn't like going on either. So, all right, you can work in here without much disturbance. Very good. And then finally, the student's failure to do his assignments will surely blank his teacher. Perturb. Yes, perturb his teacher in this. I think that we could obviously say disturb, but I think that would be a little silly. It is perturb that is the more proper word to use in this case. So I think that what we'll do is, like I say, I'm just going to set this up for next. But what we'll do is we'll take a little bit of time to speak about this historical root in culture from Roman times. Now, before we read this stuff, or some of it, we won't read all of it, I want to go back to the beginning of this chapter in this Latin book. So this is a kind of spooky picture. Obviously, we have a skeleton here, and he's not exactly a happy-go-lucky looking skeleton either. This was kind of a strange thing, maybe strange to us, especially in modern times, but especially very wealthy Roman citizens had the connection between eating, like sitting down and having a feast or a meal and meditating about death. After all, whenever we are eating something, I believe that the reason why they connected this was that when you're eating, you are taking the life of something else and putting it into you, whether it's a cow or a deer, or it's a fruit or vegetable. You're still taking life to put it into you. So this is maybe why there's such a connection. The skeleton has two things in his hands, and it's basically water pitchers, we could call them in modern English. The old-fashioned word for them is amphora, or amphorae for multiple ones. This, strangely enough, this mosaic that we see here is actually a tabletop. So some strange things in Roman society that are, I think, pretty different than now. But there is still one big connection that we share, which is the idea of coming together with friends and enjoying the, I guess, company of people together while we're eating. I'm just going to show you some pictures of this before we get into the afterlife stuff that we're going to read. The Romans loved having dinner parties, we could call them, is really what they were. They ate their, we want to say the dining room in ancient Roman times was called the triclinium, which is, well, we've done the root for tri, which means three, which basically translates something like the three couches is kind of how it's translated to. And it was basically a room with three long couches, and people would eat in Roman times, especially fancier, more wealthy Romans would eat lying on their side like this, which is kind of strange, but it was what they would do. the idea of coming together and having a feast with your friends was something that was very important to the Romans and the Greeks as well, but I think especially with Roman people. Things, for instance, things like Christmas dinner, Thanksgiving dinner, these kinds of things that we do still in the Western world, where we come together and we celebrate a specific event going on through eating together with our families, is very, very, very much in Roman culture. The ancient Romans had their version of what we would call Christmas, which was called Saturnalia. It was a celebration for the god Saturn. And they would have large feasts, very joyful feasts. Actually, the joyful nature of Christmas that we're a lot of the times talking about now actually comes from the ancient Roman traditions of Saturnalia. So here's another strange thing that the Romans would do with their dining rooms, is that this is this is not actual pieces of food here. This is another mosaic that is just showing pieces of table scraps left behind after a dinner, or a cena, as it is called in Latin. And it's kind of strange. But the idea to the Romans was that they were kind of showing off, like, look, I have all of these parties, there's always food here, was the idea that they were getting across. So let's move into, here's another spooky tabletop. So symbolic of man's fate, this mosaic tabletop comes from a summer triclinium. And of course, this is the dining room, as I've said. So it's kind of a spooky thing, but one of the big reasons why the Romans did this all the time, thinking about death all the time, when they're eating, when they're doing things, going to war, all of these different aspects of Roman life, they were really thinking about death a lot. A big reason is because of we could say a philosophy that the Romans lived by, and I'm going to write it into the chat, which maybe some of us have heard this before. It is still said, carpe. One second. There we are. Nope, sorry, everyone. My mouse is being funny. There we go. Carpe diem. Carpe diem. So this diem, we'll start with this word. It sounds a little bit like a word we use all the time in English. The word day. Just like a daytime. And so this is the word for day, diem. And carpe is seize, or to capture something, seize, right? So seize the day is what this means. Carpe diem, seize the day. This is what the Romans lived by. If there was one thing that we can kind of summarize what they really wanted everybody to behave like, this is it. And it was the idea that you're not going to last forever, so you shouldn't be wasting your time. You should be doing your diligence while being alive. And a lot of the times there's a lot of stuff about duty to society and these kinds of things, and that's part of the reason why the Romans believed that work was one of the highest things that was of value. It's not so different from it's not everybody in, say, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and England thinks like this, where work is the most important thing, but it is a very, very, very old tradition in the Western world. The idea that we respect people by how much they take advantage of their time and use it really well. This is a very, very much coming from our ancient Roman roots. After all, The Romans really spread all of their philosophies that they could to anywhere that they took over. Hopefully that explains a little bit of that stuff, why they would meditate on death while they're having some food. Why wouldn't they just enjoy that? It's a little different, a little strange indeed. So we'll read a bit of this before we go back. So I want to talk a bit about this particular aspect of our ancient Roman ancestors, and is because a lot of the times people, maybe not so much now, but for a long time, the average person had the belief that the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, more often than not, didn't believe that there was anything after you died. This isn't true. There were some people who did believe this in ancient Roman times, but they tended to be very, very, very educated, and usually they were philosophers. So very book people, if you want to think. So some of the things that the ancient Romans did for the dead and would kind of have these little rituals, some of them we still do today. And I'll pick out a few. We won't read all of this. We'll pick through some of the most important details just so you can see what I mean. So before I start, this is actually a part of what is left of the Via Sacra, which is we can think of like the big highway that went right into Rome in ancient times. These here along the Via Sacra are actually old tombs. And if we were to go 2,000 years ago back into the past, these would look very, very, very fancy at the time. Like almost like ornate little houses for the dead. The word for this is necro. The word for this area is a necropolis. So we have learned the root polis, that means city in ancient Greek, and a necro meaning the dead. So this is the city for the dead. So it's a little odd. Why would you, on the way right into your big, beautiful city of Rome, the most fantastic place in the ancient world, especially to the Romans, that's the way they treated their city, why would you have this? And it was because all of the famous heroes, the war heroes of Rome, and certain politicians and other very important famous people from Roman culture and society would be buried along through here, so that as people came into the city, they would kind of be like, oh, wow, look at this. Like, I feel like I'm interacting with all of these people. We will read that it was not only just for this aspect, but that there was a little bit of some, I guess, spiritual beliefs to these things. So the Romans usually placed tombs of the dead by the side of roads or just outside of towns. More often than not, they are outside of the main business areas of the town. They often would never want to place the dead near the main business areas. The dead were to be close to the living, but not so close. There was always a little bit of a distance. The tombs of Pompeii can still be seen along the roads that go just north of the Herculaneum Gate and south to the Necrea Gate. Some of the tombs were grand and impressive and looked like small houses. Others were plain and simple. Inside a tomb, there was a chest or a vase containing the ashes of the dead person. Sometimes there were recesses in, or we can think of also like shelves in the walls of the tombs to contain several family members. So the neat thing is that some of the urns, so where they would place their ashes, did look like little temple-like houses. And unfortunately, this book doesn't give us any nice pictures of them, but they are kind of cool, actually, because they do. They look like maybe about this big or so, like a small little temple that you could hold and place somebody's ashes inside of. Um, it's part of an old belief that you needed to give the dead what they had in life and that would make them more happy. So we won't read all of these things here. One big thing is to say is that cremation, so when somebody had died, they would burn away their body. This was the main way that the Romans treated the dead. But it changed. It changed completely. And one of the main reasons is because the religion of Christianity later on, after the Greek and Roman religion was not being practiced anymore, believed that the body was sacred and that you would kind of rise from the dead if you were a good Christian. So, in building their cemetery along busy roads and not peaceful and secluded places, the Romans were not showing any lack of respect. On the contrary, they believed that unless the dead were properly treated, their ghosts would haunt the living and possibly do them harm. And this is is interesting. This about the idea of treating the dead in a positive way and making sure that people die in a happy state and not a negative state is still very present in, say, modern spooky movies, modern horror movies about poltergeists and ghosts and things like this, are usually taking from this very idea that somebody's spirit is in a real bad state and it's kind of taking out its negativity on other people. This isn't only in Western culture, it's also in the Eastern world, in China and Japan. Lots of places like that have very, very similar beliefs, which is neat. So there's one very specific piece of information here about them. So it was most important to provide the dead with a tomb or a grave where their ghosts could have a home. But it was also thought that they would want to be close to life, to the life of the living. One tomb inscription says this: "I see and gaze upon all who come and go from the city." Another says, "Lollius has been placed by the side of the roads that in order that everyone who passes by may say to him, 'Hello, Lollius.'" So it's kind of interesting belief, but there was this idea that they could have power still. It was believed that the dead in some ways continued activities of life, therefore had to be supplied with the things they would need. A craftsman would want their tools, a woman would want her jewelry, children their toys, and this is common. I think still people sometimes will do this and place the objects that were most connected to that person with them. There's some of this that still happens in the modern world. It's a little bit less than these times. These times it was much more. Of course, we have a lot of graves that have been found in archaeology with, especially like women's jewelry. Oftentimes lots and lots of jewelry is found with the graves of women. So their possessions were often burnt with them, as it says here. And this is the one part that I really want to talk about because this is kind of neat. So the ghosts of the dead were thought to be hungry and thirsty and therefore had to be given food and drink. And we can actually see here, this is a urn, this cylinder looking thing here. and that there is actually a wooden straw, we can kind of think of it as, to place offerings, either wine or food for the deceased person. It was a sort of sacrifice to them. We can think of it in this way, but it was in a way seen as a kind of offering to them. Offerings of eggs, beans, lentils, and flour and wine were placed regularly at the tomb. Sometimes holes were made in the tomb so that food and wine could be poured inside. Wine was a convenient substitute for blood, the favorite drink of the dead. At the funeral and on special occasions, animals were sacrificed and their blood was offered. And this is true, but this is the same for worshiping the gods in Roman and Greek culture. So we can see some cool pictures here of kind of what's going on. This would be more for, I guess, more poor people, more average people would be buried like so, not in extremely elaborate tombs like we see here along the Via Sacra. It was thought, however, that in spite these attempts to look after them, the dead did not live a very happy existence. In order to help them forget their unhappiness, their tombs were often decorated with flowers and surrounded by little gardens, a custom which has lasted to this day, like I say. But it's interesting, this custom may still go on, and we still do see in graves, right? People bring flowers and offer flowers to the grave stone of maybe their grandparents or something like this. But it's interesting how that has stayed, though we don't think in the same ways that the ancient people did of why we're doing this. So, and then here's an interesting thing too, speaking of that relationship we were talking about between food and eating and the dead, is that there was sometimes open air dining rooms outside of the tomb where relatives could feast with the dead. This idea of being together with them still. So we won't read all of this. We do want to read a little bit about this guy, Epicurus. So Epicurus, he was a philosopher, and this is one of the people who believed that when people died, that their soul just kind of dissipated into the air, and that there wasn't really a life after death in the same way that many of the traditional people were. Later on, the Catholic Church often took this a little bit further, kind of making it seem like more people believed in this than not, and this isn't the case. So to read a section about that, so some people also believed in the Greek myths about an underworld where the wicked were punished for their crimes and the good would live happily forever. There were a few people who did not believe in any form of life after death. These were the followers of a Greek philosopher named Epicurus, who taught that when a man died, the breath that gave him life dissolved into the air and was lost forever. Most Romans, however, felt no need to question their traditional beliefs and customs, which kept the dead alive in their memories and ensured that their spirits were happy and at peace. So it's interesting. Some of these things are still believed today. Some of them are a little bit different. But it is interesting to see things that are the same between lots of different cultures. For instance, the idea of sacrificing or offering something to your ancestors, very much an important part of Roman culture, but also very much an important part of Chinese culture and even Native American culture as well. So there's some things that, in a way, time may change, but we do still practice one way or another, even if the religions of the world are not exactly the same as they were in ancient times. So let's look at a couple of words. We may as well while we're looking at this book before we switch back. So let's see some of the ones that we have not done before. So cannot or cannawit is eats, and it's also dinner or dines. Conspectic is catches sight of. So we also have the word conspire that comes from conspicit. Cum, of course, this is the word that we've been talking about a whole lot because we've, in our word roots, been looking at con and cum and all of these different words that look like this, which is very much just the word for with in Latin. I think that we've seen the root fac, F-A-C, and we've learned that root to mean makes or does, doing. This is, of course, the root for words like factory, facility, facilitate. We have seen, I think, many of these words in art studies, but this is the original form of the verb. So heri means yesterday, though it's not exactly the same, but I suppose it is still good to see that not everything from ancient Latin has made its way into modern English. Some of it hasn't. So, like I say, heri and yesterday, we have moved away from this. Whereas in the word hodie means today, and there is still a little bit of connection with that word. Ingens huge intelligit, intellexit is understands. So what word can we think intelligit, I should say. What's a word that we get from this in English? Intelligent. Yeah, and that's interesting in itself because it just means understands. This chapter doesn't have the word, but we have a similar word that has sort of changed its meaning over time. It's related to its original meaning, but it's the word science, actually. And it comes from scientia in Latin, which is more so just another word for wisdom. So it means something much more specific than wisdom now. And this verb is also, we can see it's in the same kind of thing. For instance, our intellect is not a verb at all anymore, right? And someone's intellect is now a noun. We've seen lacrimat and lacrimavit, which is cries. This is the verb for crying. This is definitely a big root. We still take it much, much, much from mortuus. This is dead or the dead, we can think. Can we think of any ones that come from this? There's lots. Mortal, yes. Mourn, yes, indeed. Any other ones that we can think of? Can somebody think of a profession that uses mort? Somebody know? It's a mortician is somebody who deals with the dead. So yes, this is also a very, very, very used root. There's tons more than this, of course. And in, I don't know about Spanish, but I know French for sure. This is pretty much the same word, except the us, this ending here, the Latin declension ending has disappeared in French. We've definitely seen narawit. We don't need to go over this, but this is tells or relates. Now, what it means by relates is more so like telling somebody information. And very good. That was what I was going to ask next, is what's a word coming from this, is narrate. So with this word, that's different than, say, I don't know if this class has seen it, but we've seen there are other Latin words to say, like yell or say. Actually, yes, we have dicta, right? Dicta is like to say or tell something. Nerat is more like you're kind of giving information to somebody. There's a little bit of the idea of a story there to some extent. And that's why narrate, narration, a narrator, all of these words are using this word rather than dicta, because the root dicta is much more of a like a command more than this. This is much more of a kind of a gentle verb. And this is actually gives me a little bit of time to say that this is the tricky thing, is that Latin is pretty specific. There's a lot of different words for things in English that we might even just use one word for, but there's very different specific words in Latin. This is one of the reasons why, because maybe some of us might be thinking, why do we say for medicine and science and all of this stuff, why are we using Latin and Greek words? Why don't we just use English words? And the reason is that Latin has these really specific words. Ancient Greek is even more really specific than Latin. But this is why. It's just a very descriptive language. Part of it is because it has just been historically, the Romans took over a lot of different places, so they taught this language to people, and then the church kept teaching it. There is that historical part of it as well, but there's also a little bit more of a natural part of this. So nekat and nekawit is kills. We have words that come from this, though they're not super common. It's usually words that are used in, say, criminal sciences, forensics, stuff like that, where we will be using the word for nekawit, right? Crime scene investigation things. We've seen nihil and omnis before. Definitely, I think we've seen nihil. Nihil means nothing. We talked about how somebody who is a nihilist is somebody who doesn't believe in anything. That was quite a while ago, but this is where this is coming from, nihil. And omnes, so this is for anybody who's taking an English class about creative writing. We talk about how there's different kinds of narrations in books, how there's first person narration, third person omniscient, third person semi-omniscient, these kinds of words. That word omniscient is coming from omnis, meaning all or everything in Latin. And that's one thing that can help you in school so much, is that when you interact with a word in any kind of study, whether it's in public school, in university, in high school, it doesn't matter. There's always once or twice a weird word that you interact with when it comes to studying. A lot of the times it has a Latin meaning that's just really simple, oftentimes. Parat, I don't think there's too many other ones that Takte is quietly, and we have seen tactus, which is skillfully. We get a whole lot from this because the root is tact, T-A-C. Sometimes it will have a T on the end in English, but usually it's just TAC. Can anybody think of some roots that come from takte? So quietly. It also means skillfully as well, like to do something very skillfully. Tactics, for instance, actually comes from this. So, you know, whenever you're playing a board game or something like this, you're being using a lot of tactics is using kind of skill to make things better, to win the game. All right, I don't think there's anything else, but there is teret, which is, we won't spend a whole lot of time on this, and teruit, which is frightens, and obviously we get the word terrify and terror from this. Okay, that's good. This leaves us with a little bit of time to do some of the others. I will say, actually, so this is just some mythological figures down here, but I want to test to see if anybody can get this one. So as it says here, dead sinners being punished in the underworld. Sisyphus, who's a god, had to roll a giant stone forever. So he actually, they don't say the rest of the story, but he has to roll a stone up the hill, and then the stone goes down the hill, and then he has to go down the hill again, and he has to push the stone back up. This was his punishment. Ixion was tied to a revolving wheel, and Tantalus was never able to quench his raging thirst. Tantalus. Tantalus. This is a name of a god or a mythological character in Greek mythology, but we get an English word for something about being thirsty. I will give you that. And can anybody get it? Does anybody know? So it sounds very similar to Tantalus. Okay, very good guess. Tangy is a very good guess. Tantalizing, super good. Very, 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 very good. Awesome. So yeah, tantalizing. And so that's, for anybody who doesn't know, that's like when you really want to have, we'll just use a glass of water, for example. Say you've been in the desert for a day, and then somebody holds a glass of water up in front of you and says, no, but you can't have the water. What you feel in that moment is tantalization, is what we call it. And it's interesting because this whole word is just coming from the name of a god. And there are many other words that we will actually come across in word roots that are just coming from the names of different people from stories, which is really, really cool whenever we come across words that, yes, we have some, I guess, obvious ones like teret, which is, it just means to frighten something. Okay, this makes sense that terrify comes from this. But something like this, like for Tantalus, for instance, you kind of have to know the story to understand, this is why it's named this. There's lots others out there that we'll come across. For instance, I think the only other one I can think of right now is there is a god named Protos in ancient Greek mythology, and the word for proto and proton come from his name, actually. So that is one reason I'll say to you guys all is some people, when they get to university or college, whatever they go to, they will say, why is it that everybody takes Greek mythology? Why is Greek mythology, everybody says this is an important thing to take? I don't understand. I don't want to worship the Greek gods. And that makes sense that you feel this way. But this is the reason why, that it's kind of important to take at least some of those stories and learn what happens in them is because a lot of our, not just our words, but the things we do in the Western world are revolving around a lot of these old stories. And so when you know them, it actually makes your knowledge of what you read a lot better. All right, so good. That was lots of fun, and we got, like I say, it's good to see some of those other words that aren't just more of the obvious ones that are a little bit unique, where it's actually maybe the name of a god, for instance. We have a lot of other ones. I think probably the more common one is Cupid, the god Cupid of love. We do actually have a few words that are coming off of his name. But yes, and some of them aren't such obvious gods either. Some of them are, like, for instance, Tantalus is not a incredibly common figure in Greek and Roman religion. Okay, so we have about 8 minutes left. We should be able to get into the next group of words, at least introduce them. Okay, so for lesson 24, we really do have a focus on different roots here.